The Andes Mountains rise along the spine of South America in layers of granite and ice. At 13,000 feet, oxygen thins, wind moves without friction, snow covers rock in drifts that remain year-round. The passes between peaks are narrow. Weather systems arrive without warning. The landscape does not negotiate. In the austral spring of 1972, the range stretched unbroken from Santiago to Mendoza, a corridor of white ridges barely wide enough for aircraft. Most commercial flights avoided the higher altitudes. Smaller planes, older models, flew the passes when visibility allowed. On Friday, October 13th, visibility was reported as marginal. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 departed Montevideo early that afternoon. It was a chartered Fairchild FH227D turboprop carrying 45 passengers and crew. Most of the passengers were members of a rugby union team from Stella Maris College in Montevideo, along with family members, supporters, and friends. The team had arranged the flight to Santiago for a match. The aircraft stopped in Mendoza, Argentina, to refuel. Weather over the Andes was worsening. The crew decided to wait overnight. The following day, October 13th, conditions improved marginally. The pilots chose to proceed. The flight path required crossing the Andes via Planchon Pass. Standard procedure called for climbing to sufficient altitude before entering the pass, then descending once past the ridgeline into Chilean airspace. Navigation depended on visual landmarks and radio beacons. Cloud cover was heavy. Visibility dropped. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the co-pilot radioed Curicó, a town on the Chilean side, believing the aircraft had cleared the mountains. He began descent. The aircraft had not cleared the mountains. It was still deep inside the range, surrounded by peaks. The right wing struck a ridgeline first. The impact tore it from the fuselage. The left wing followed. The tail section separated. The fuselage, now a tube of aluminum without wings or tail, tobogganed down a steep snowfield at over 200 miles per hour. It struck a second slope and came to rest, buried partially in snow at approximately 11,800 feet on a remote glacier, later identified as part of the Cerro Sella Massif, east of the summit, deep in Argentine territory but near the Chilean border. 12 people died in the crash or immediately after. 5 more died within the first night from injuries. The fuselage was shattered but partially intact. Seats had been ripped loose. Luggage, clothing, and metal debris lay scattered across the slope. Survivors pulled themselves from wreckage. Several had broken legs. Others had internal injuries. There was no rescue signal sent. The radio equipment was destroyed. Outside, temperature fell rapidly as the sun set. Wind picked up. Snow began again. Among the passengers were young men in their late teens and early 20s. Most were athletes. Several had some medical training from school courses. None had mountaineering experience. None had survival training for alpine conditions. They came from Montevideo, a coastal city where winter meant rain, not snow. They wore light jackets, slacks, street shoes. A few had brought sweaters. The fuselage offered minimal shelter. Wind forced snow through gaps in the torn metal. Sleeping was difficult. Cold was constant. The survivors used seat cushions for insulation and pulled luggage around the openings to block wind. They salvaged what they could. There were a few chocolate bars, some wine, a small amount of candy, a few pieces of fruit. No substantial food supply had been loaded. The flight was supposed to last less than 4 hours. Rationing began immediately. Portions were minimal. Each person received a capful of wine and a single square of chocolate per day. The system was organized by those still able to move. Discipline held. On the second day, several survivors attempted to climb the surrounding slopes to survey the area. The snow was deep and unstable. Altitude made movement exhausting. After an hour of climbing, they reached a point high enough to see in all directions. There was nothing. No valleys, no roads, no rivers. Only an endless succession of white ridges extending to the horizon in every direction. The realization settled slowly. They were not near the edge of the range. They were in its center. The aircraft had crashed far off course. Distance to any human settlement was unknown, but clearly measured in dozens of miles. Walking out was not immediately feasible. They returned to the fuselage. Search efforts began within hours of the flight's disappearance. Chilean and Argentine authorities coordinated air patrols. The search area was enormous. Weather hampered visibility. The white fuselage against white snow was nearly invisible from the air. On October 21st, 8 days after the crash, search operations were officially called off. Authorities concluded that the aircraft had likely crashed in a location too remote or too high to allow for survivors. The families were informed. The survivors, unaware that the search had ended, continued to believe rescue was imminent. They marked the fuselage roof with luggage and colored fabric. They waited. Days passed. No aircraft appeared. Food ran out entirely by the end of the first week. Snow was melted for water using aluminum sheets angled toward the sun. Hunger became the dominant fact. Conversations grew quieter. Movement slowed. 2 more passengers died from injuries during the second week. Bodies were laid outside in the snow, where cold preserved them. On the 10th day, one of the survivors, a medical student named Roberto Canessa, raised the question that others had been avoiding. The bodies of the dead were frozen. Protein was necessary for survival. There was no other source. The discussion that followed was not recorded in detail, but accounts indicate it was quiet, difficult, and brief. Religious objections were acknowledged. Desperation was undeniable. A few of the survivors agreed to make the first attempt. Using shards of glass from the aircraft, they cut small pieces of flesh from a body lying in the snow. The meat was frozen. It was consumed raw. No one spoke during the act. Afterward, several vomited. Others refused entirely at first. Over the following days, refusal became unsustainable. Starvation overcame revulsion. The practice became systematic. Routine emerged slowly. Each morning, a small team exited the fuselage to retrieve and prepare tissue. Pieces were distributed among those willing to eat. Prayers were said beforehand. The dead were treated with as much respect as the circumstances allowed. Names were not spoken aloud during the process. The survivors referred to the flesh only as meat. Rationing continued. Portions remained small. Nutritional intake was barely sufficient to prevent further deterioration. Several survivors experienced severe diarrhea. Others showed signs of scurvy. Energy levels did not recover. Days blurred. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through openings in the wreckage and filled the interior within seconds. Survivors trapped inside fought to reach air pockets. 8 more people suffocated before they could be dug out. The remaining survivors, now numbering 27, excavated the fuselage over the following day. Bodies were pulled from the snow and placed outside. Morale collapsed. Arguments broke out. Some lost the will to continue. Others insisted on maintaining order. The system held, but only barely. By early November, it became clear that rescue was not coming. The only option was self-rescue. 3 survivors, Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parrado, and Antonio Vizintin, began preparing for an expedition westward toward Chile. The plan was to climb out of the crash site, cross the surrounding peaks, and reach a valley or settlement. Preparation took weeks. Clothing was improvised. Pieces of seat covers were stitched into sleeping bags. Fabric from the fuselage was wrapped around legs and feet. Sunglasses were fashioned from plastic visors and wire. Food was gathered. Small strips of frozen flesh, wrapped in cloth, rationed carefully. Water bottles were made from emptied wine containers. Physical conditioning was impossible in their weakened state, but the 3 attempted short climbs daily to build stamina. The weather worsened. Snowstorms delayed departure repeatedly. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin left the fuselage and began climbing west. The route was nearly vertical in places. Snow was waist-deep. Progress was measured in hundreds of feet per day. At night, they huddled together in the makeshift sleeping bag. Temperature fell below 0. Wind threatened frostbite. After 4 days, they reached a ridge high enough to see beyond the immediate peaks. To the west, instead of valleys, there were more mountains. range after range, disappearing into distance. The sight broke them briefly. Parado insisted they continue. Vizintin was sent back to conserve supplies. Parado and Canessa descended the western slope and entered a new valley. For 3 more days, they walked. Snow gave way to rock. Rock gave way to sparse vegetation. On December 20th, they encountered a river. Following the river downstream, they eventually saw cattle, then a man on horseback. The man, a Chilean peasant named Sergio Catalan, saw 2 emaciated figures in rags on the opposite bank. Communication was impossible across the rushing water. Catalan threw them bread tied to a rock. He rode for help. The following day, December 21st, Chilean authorities were informed. Helicopters were dispatched. On December 22nd and 23rd, 72 days after the crash, the remaining 14 survivors at the fuselage were evacuated by helicopter in 2 waves. 16 individuals had survived. They were transported to hospitals in Santiago. Immediate medical treatment began. Most suffered from severe malnutrition, dehydration, frostbite, and infected wounds. Recovery took months. News of the rescue spread internationally within hours. Initial reports celebrated survival. Within days, journalists began asking how 16 people had survived 10 weeks in the Andes without food supplies. The survivors remained silent initially. Pressure mounted. On December 26th, 4 days after rescue, the survivors held a press conference in Santiago. They confirmed what investigators had already suspected. They explained the decision in clinical terms. They expressed sorrow. They requested understanding. Public reaction was mixed. Some condemned the act as barbarism. Others recognized it as the only rational choice under impossible conditions. Religious authorities in Uruguay and Chile issued statements. The Catholic Church acknowledged the moral complexity and refrained from explicit condemnation, noting the absence of malice and the context of extreme necessity. The 16 survivors returned to Uruguay in early January 1973. They were met by families and crowds. Attention was overwhelming. Several withdrew from public life. Others spoke openly about the experience in later years. 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, wrote memoirs decades later. The accounts differ slightly in detail but align on the central facts. No attempt was made to obscure what had occurred. The bodies of the deceased were later recovered in subsequent expeditions to the crash site. Families were given the option of repatriation. Many chose to leave the remains in the mountains. The survival of the 16 was not a result of luck. It was a result of systematic discipline, group cohesion, and the willingness to make a decision that violated deeply held norms. The choice was not taken lightly. It was made incrementally, quietly, and with full awareness of its weight. The survivors did not celebrate survival, they carried it. What remains in the historical record is not an adventure or a thriller. It is a question about the limits of human endurance, the conditions under which moral frameworks collapse, and the price of continuing to live when every option has become unthinkable. The mountains offered no comfort, no redemption, and no mercy. 16 people walked out, 29 did not. The cold did not distinguish.